Welcome to the latest video in our KISS flight controller series. In the first video we talked about the technology, the second one we put it all together, programmed it and then had it flying, and then in the other videos we've done things like added a buzzer and also talked about how you check what the rate RC and other bits and pieces in the GUI do in terms of how responsive the craft is in the air. In this one we're going to talk about how you add an on-screen display, and we're going to be using a minim OSD. You can get these in lots of various sizes. There's the micro, mini and also the full-size version as well, and for those of you that have been on the channel for a while, you'll have watched us attach these minim OSDs onto pretty much every flight controller we've had our hands on. Now, to make these things work you have to have very specific software that's set up for not only the board that you're about to talk to, but sometimes the version of the software that's running on it as well. And it's just the same with this, so we're going to have to do a couple of things to get this board working. We're going to have to install the fonts that are for the on-screen display, we're going to have to install the on-screen display itself, and then we're going to have to connect the board to the KISS flight controller as well as to our video transmitter and our camera so it can overlay the telemetry information on top of the image that the camera is seeing. This on-screen display isn't for the KISS flight controller. This is one that's actually come from Hobby King. I'll put a link in the description, and this is one that we're going to flash as part of this setup with the new bits and pieces we need to make it work with the KISS flight controller. Now, what it actually looks like in use at the end is in each corner of the image you have the status from each of the ESCs. Now, as we've already talked about, there is a very clever single wire telemetry connection that connects all the parts of the KISS system together, so the ESCs are constantly talking to the flight controller about their temperature, how much current they're pulling and everything else, and that is presented in each corner along with a bit of a summary down at the bottom as well on what's actually going on. The first thing we need to talk about are the two websites that are going to be really useful for you. The first one is this one here. This is the version 1.05 of the manual. There might be later ones out there. If you search for KISS manual version 1.05 you'll find it, but you'll probably get later versions by the time you watch this video. And if you go all the way down here towards the bottom, then here is the connections for how you're going to connect OSD to your flight controller. And the way this works is that you connect the transmit to the receive pin on the board, the receive pin to the transmit pin, so the telemetry information from the KISS flight controller is coming over these two wires here. There's a ground as well connected if for security. I'm actually using it without the ground and it seems to be working fine, but if you're going to wire it up then the ground actually just connects here at the bottom, and then you have a separate 5-volt supply. Now I'm actually powering mine by plugging my 5-volt and ground into these two pins, and that's working great. It does pull a little bit more current than the KISS flight controller can comfortably handle, so it does recommend in here that you actually power it separately. So I've also added a little additional battery illuminator circuit to run the on-screen display, and you'd probably have to do that too. And then the other connections you need to make here are the video in connects to the camera, and then the video out connects to the video transmitter along with an associated ground. And the way we have it set up that we'll look at in a sec, I've actually connected the plus 5 volts, which is how the camera is powered in our case, just with a single red cable that kind of runs between the two. So in effect what's happening is the board is just sat in between the signal that's coming out the camera, so it can overlay the on-screen display information and then go and send that to the video transmitter so we can see it in our goggles. So this is the great diagram. This is the way you're going to have to wire this up, so we'll come back to that in a while. And the second thing then is this fantastic page here on RC groups. I'll put the link in the description that goes through the entire process, and this is the one we're going to follow. You will need to download all the pieces that it's talking about here. The multi-wii on-screen display software isn't going to be used for anything apart from uploading the specific font file that you're going to need for the on-screen display. Now the micro minim OSD that we're using here, as with all minim OSDs, actually has two areas of memory, if you want to think of it like that. One of them holds the font files and the other one holds the program that it runs to create the on-screen display. A very common problem that everyone gets into is they forget to update or replace the font files, so although the on-screen display is running, they never see the text because the font file isn't in memory. So when it's going to there to find the number 7, because that's what it wants to show you, there's nothing there, so you don't get to see anything. So you have to upload both things. The multi-week OSD is to get those font files on there. The KISS OSD download is the one that gives you the font file, but also the code, the program that's also going to run alongside it and with those fonts to put it on the screen, and that's going to go on here as well. And the last one then is a link to the Arduino program that you use to do this. You'll need to have all 3 of those on your PC for this to work. Last thing you're going to need is an FTDI adapter. Now, we've looked at FTDI adapters in tons of videos on the channel. We've used it to configure GPSs, on-screen displays, flight controllers, ESCs, you name it, we have used this to talk to it. If you haven't got one already, definitely worthwhile getting hold of one and putting it in the spares bag, because the day you need it, it's worth its weight in gold. Search for FTDI Basic and you should find something similar to what we've got here. There are versions around that don't have the genuine FTDI chip on it. If it doesn't, then it gets a little bit more complicated and tricky to use. But if you search for FTDI Basic and the board looks something like the one we have in our hands here, then you're going to be good. So now we've got that, I'll go and download these 3 things onto our netbook. Let me show you what we need to do to connect the FTDI adapter to the Micro Minim OSD, and then we can plug it into a USB cable and start all of the configuration. I've taken the little board out the packet and I've installed and soldered the pins onto it. Now actually for this we don't need these pins at the bottom. These are if you're going to connect external sensors to things like the battery voltage and stuff. The firmware for the KISS flight controller is only interested in listening to what the flight controller is telling it, so it's not really taking anything from these right now, so we don't need to worry. The other thing I've done is I've made these pins at the side. These, if you remember, are your video in and your video out, and here's that little red cable that we talked about. Just double check how your camera and video transmitter are wired up, and you can just make whatever adapters you need here. These just happen to be the 2 that work for me. So you can see here we have the ground and the video signal, and we have the ground and the video signal, and then we also have the red cable that's going from one to the other, so that the 5 volts that comes from my video transmitter can just go straight through and out the other side. So this is how it works, and this has been set up for a immersion RC video transmitter, which is why the order's like that. It might not be for you. Now the other thing we need to check is on this board, the way it works is these top pins, it goes ground, ground, 5 volts, then you have the 2 signal pins and then ground. So looking at the top like this, where we have our ground and plus 5 volts on this side, it's ground, ground and plus 5 volts. Plus 5 volts is that 5 in that middle pin. Now on the top of your FTDI, if you have one the same as ours, you'll see that it's ground, CTS 5 volts, transmit, receive and data terminal ready, DTR. Now on this one we need to make sure that the 5 volt pin matches the 5 volt pin on here, which this way round is like that. So now our 2 boards are plugged together. I have a USB cable that I can plug this into the PC. So let's go over to the PC and plug this little guy in, and we can first of all go through the software we've downloaded, then start to configure everything before we start plugging it into the KISS flight controller. On the laptop we've downloaded those 2 bits of software. I've put them on this folder on the desktop so you can see everything. There is the KISS OSD folder, and in here we have a couple of things. We have the font file that we're going to need to upload. We also have the INO file that is the actual firmware that we're going to create. As you can see at the moment, it's quite small and basic for the KISS flight controller. And then we have another directory that we need to copy somewhere in a minute. So that's one thing. The other thing that we've got in here is just the MultiWii OSD release 1.6. We're going to use this for one thing only, and that's use the graphical user interface, the GUI here, to actually run it and upload that font file that we've just looked at onto the board. Now let's do that first. So the first thing we're going to do then is we're going to plug the board into the PC. So here it is The cable's plugged in already, but we haven't plugged it into the PC. So I'm going to plug it into the PC now. And hopefully what you can see is we have kind of a blue light on the on-screen display and nothing else is happening. That's usually a really good sign. That means that we haven't knackered it. You can see now that the green light is pulsing. That means that it is working, so that's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start the multi-week OSD GUI, and hopefully if your board already has some kind of flight controller firmware on it, we're going to be able to talk to it and just use this on-screen display to upload that font file. So here we have the graphical user interface. We're going to connect the COM port should appear here. If you just click on it, then it should populate everything. It means that it's actually talking to the on-screen display, but you might find that you have a couple of problems. That depends on the on-screen display software that's on here. However, all we're going to do is we're going down here to Font Tools. We're going to click on Select. We're going to find that font file. So we're actually going to go onto the desktop. We're going to go into the KISS OSD. We're going to find the KISS OSD folder that's in that. There's the font file. We're going to click Open. It'll take a second to load all those fonts. There's 256 characters. Once it does, it'll tell me it's complete. Fantastic. And now we are going to say Upload, and this is going to put each of those font files onto the board. So it's not used for anything else, just to get the font files. And you'll notice that the little red light on top of the FTDI is flashing in time to us uploading each one of the 256 characters, and that's going to work its way through this. I'm not going to sit here while it goes through all 256 because it takes a minute or two. What we'll do is we'll come back in a minute and we'll finish off. Once it's uploaded all the fonts, then you can exit out of this. What I do is click Close COM and then turn this off, and then you've done the font files, and then we'll look at the firmware. Now that we have the fonts safely on the board, we've just unplugged it from the USB so it's nice and dark again, we have no LEDs. Next thing to do is to prepare the firmware that's going to go onto it, that's going to use those font files and put them onto our on-screen display. Now if we go back into the folder on the desktop again, you'll remember that I talked about the fact that we had a folder that had to go somewhere. Now in the KISS OSD folder, we've already used the font file, so that's now finished with. That's great. That's the one we're going to use in a minute. The INO file, as we've said, is the actual firmware we're about to compile, put on the board, and we have this additional folder as well. Now the firmware file actually references bits and pieces that are in here, so we need to copy this into where we've downloaded the Arduino version 1.0.5 software. So let me open that. So here's our Arduino folders. So we're going to run this in a second, but what you need to do is you need to go into the libraries folder that's there as part of the installation, and in here you need to copy across that max 7456, so it's in this libraries area. So you can just cut and paste it or copy it across so it exists in here. If it doesn't, then it won't compile properly. So now we've got that ready, let's just go back up. And we're going to run the Arduino software. Now the danger is that occasionally you'll find later versions of the Arduino software, and when it's finished running, it is going to ask us if we want to update it. Now that's dangerous because normally the way it works with software is the later version is the better version. A lot of the code that's written for the on-screen display likes talking and being used with Arduino 1.0.5. Now to get this onto the actual board itself, what I'm going to do is plug the on-screen display in. So now we have that blue light with a flashing green light, and we're going to open the INO file that we were looking at before. So I'm going to say open. We're going to select that INO file, say open again. And there we have, this is actually the code that we're about to compile to upload onto the flight controller. Now, there's a couple of things that you need to check in here. Again, this is pretty basic at the moment, and part of the problem is that the image on my screen is kind of overlapping the edges. Some more sophisticated versions, hopefully they'll start updating this, will be able to move those things around. At the moment, the things you can alter are very basic. The video system, you can either have PAL or NTSC. By default, it's PAL. If you want to change that, you just comment out PAL and delete those 2 slashes before NTSC, and that's turned it into an NTSC. You need to make sure that that is the same as your camera. If it isn't the same as your camera, then you are going to be in a world of problems. Everything else should be absolutely right. There isn't an awful lot of things in here that you can change. There's a couple of things that you can change, but you can have a look through these. Everything below where this bit where it says enter configuration is actually the code. All this stuff is just things that you can alter. Now, because we're happy with that, we'll carry on. A couple of things we need to do. Go into tools. We need to select the board type as Arduino Pro or Pro Mini, 5 volt, 16 megahertz with 18 mega 328. That's the one that we want to select. If it doesn't look like this in your Arduino program, you're not using version 1.0.5, and I would stop and go and get the older version. And then the serial port, we need to make sure it's on COM7, which again is happens to be the version that we're using. That all looks great. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to click on upload. Now what's going to happen is going to go away and compile the sketch. That's what the program is called. Once it is all finished, then that sketch is going to be sent up onto our flight controller, and we'll know it's working because the lights on top of the FTDI will go bananas. On a fast machine, this isn't going to take very long at all. Our netbook is a little bit slow, but we like it like that because it allows us to explain and show every individual step. So now it's going to start uploading to the board, and there it goes. You can actually see the FTDI lights going absolutely bonkers, and that's because what's happening is the sketch is being uploaded. There we go, it has now finished. So now we have the font there, and we also have the program as well. Now we can go back and start connecting it up to the flight controller, just like in that diagram, and then we are ready to power everything up and give it a first test. Connected up to the flight controller and the craft, it looks a little bit like this. So here's the board. We have the power coming from a separate battery eliminator circuit. I've got a little one here, the smallest I could find. This one's going to plug into the flight battery, and this will provide the plus 5 volts and the ground. And the way I've got it working is I've actually plugged those into the plus 5 volts and ground that we plugged the FTDI adapter into. Then we have the receive and transmit wires from the KISS flight controller coming in here at the top. That's bringing in the data. And then the last bits here, of course, are these cables that's connected into my FPV transmitter at the back and my camera, and there's that little red wire connecting the two together. So that's how it's all wired up. Relatively straightforward. And if you make these little adapters, what I've done is it means I can just unhook it. Now I'm not going to keep the on-screen display on this KISS flight controller. I'm going to wait until the on-screen display is a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more configurable, and then hopefully it'll be a little bit more useful for me. So once I've done this, I'm actually going to take it all off and I'm going to connect the camera directly to the FPV transmitter. But now we've got this set up, we just need to plug this into the flight battery so that we get the 5 volts in, and then hopefully when we connect it all together, you'll be able to see an image that looks a little bit like this. Hopefully that helps all of you that is looking to do this and wanting to have a play with it. And now you know the process. The key things here are to upload both the firmware and the font files. And the way it works at the moment is you have to do those in 2 separate operations. The FTDI drivers, if you Google for FTDI drivers, you'll be able to find those if you're having problems with your Windows machine finding and uploading them automatically. And the other tip, of course, is make sure you're using the Arduino 1.0.5. That's the version that will work with this. If you use a later version, then you're probably going to get into trouble.
Easier to understand.
Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and happy flying.